My friends, brothers, and sisters in humanity, today I speak not to pass judgment, but to invite reflection upon our identity, our values, and the direction in which we, as a global family, are moving. Recently, a moment caught the eyes of many when the nation of Qatar welcomed a world leader, and among the symbols of hospitality were women, their hair uncovered, flowing in the desert wind. Some asked, is this Islamic? But I ask you a greater question. What does it mean to be Islamic in a world where cultures meet, where traditions evolve, and where principles must remain anchored in truth, not in appearance? Islam, like all great faiths, is not judged by spectacle, but by justice, by dignity, and by the purity of intent. Let us not divide ourselves over fabric or form. Let us instead rise to a higher plane, where we speak with wisdom, listen with patience, and act with compassion. The world does not need more outrage. It needs more understanding. In the modern world, the lines between culture and religion are often blurred, leading many to confuse what is a cultural tradition with what is a religious obligation. This confusion can result in unnecessary conflict, especially when people from different backgrounds or traditions interact. One of the most important things to recognize is that Islam, as a religion, provides universal principles and guidance, while cultures may shape how those principles are expressed in different societies. For example, the way modesty is observed in Indonesia may differ greatly from how it is practiced in Saudi Arabia or Turkey. The essence of modesty remains the same in Islamic teachings, but the outward appearance can vary based on local customs and norms. It is critical to remember that while Islam does provide clear guidelines, especially regarding morality, behavior, and modesty, the cultural packaging of these guidelines is not always uniform. In the case of Qatar's reception of a foreign dignitary like Donald Trump, with women presenting themselves in a certain way, what we witnessed was likely a cultural presentation meant to reflect Qatar's modern identity and diplomatic openness. These women were not necessarily trying to challenge Islamic teachings. They may have been representing a blend of tradition, hospitality, and modern representation. The presence of flowing hair does not automatically indicate an abandonment of Islamic values, just as the wearing of traditional garments does not always guarantee spiritual depth. The problem arises when people see such visuals and immediately pass religious judgment, without taking the time to understand the broader context. Islam is a religion of wisdom, justice, and compassion. It encourages believers to reflect before they react, to understand before they accuse. Judging a society's faith based solely on images or outward appearances can be misleading. It is also important to remember that Islamic teachings caution us against suspicion and haste in making conclusions about others. This applies not just to individuals but to nations and cultures as well. Islam is not monolithic, and its expression varies across time and place. The diversity within the Muslim world is not a weakness. It is a sign of the richness and adaptability of the faith. When we mistake cultural expression for religious deviation, we create unnecessary division among Muslims. Instead of building unity and understanding, we sow seeds of judgment and hostility. This is especially dangerous in a world already fractured by sectarianism, political agendas, and media-driven narratives. We must rise above superficial judgments and focus on the core teachings of Islam, which prioritize intention, character, and piety over form and fashion. The question should not only be, is this Islamic, but also, are we practicing the spirit of Islam in how we react, speak, and judge? Islam is a faith rooted in principles that emphasize morality, humility, and sincerity, and among those principles is modesty. However, modesty in Islam is not defined by a singular style of clothing or a universal dress code that applies identically across all regions and cultures. Rather, it is a value that encompasses both inner character and outward behavior. The command to dress modestly applies to both men and women, and its purpose is to reflect decency, dignity, and self-respect. Yet how this principle is interpreted and implemented can vary greatly depending on cultural context, societal norms, and historical evolution. What is considered modest attire in one Muslim country may differ from another, but that does not necessarily mean one is more Islamic than the other. The heart of the matter lies in the intention behind the action, not just the appearance itself. It is important to understand that Islam does not enforce a strict uniform on women or men. Instead, it lays down broad guidelines to cover the body appropriately, to avoid attracting unnecessary attention, and to maintain dignity in public life. These guidelines are interpreted differently by scholars, communities, and individuals. For example, some Muslim women choose to wear the hijab, others wear abayas, and some may cover their heads loosely or not at all. Each choice can be influenced by personal understanding, level of faith, family tradition, or even the legal and social frameworks of the country they live in. Islam does not mandate conformity in outward form, but it does require sincerity and a commitment to modesty in both heart and action. It is a spiritual principle before it is a physical rule. When modesty becomes a subject of scrutiny based solely on appearance, especially in media or public commentary, it reduces a deeply spiritual value into a surface-level judgment. This not only undermines the depth of Islamic teachings, but also discourages honest conversations about faith and identity. It is not for outsiders, or even fellow Muslims, to determine someone's faith or modesty based purely on how they dress. The Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, taught us to look beyond the outer shell and to consider the condition of the heart. He never imposed uniformity, but rather inspired sincerity and humility. He dealt with people of all levels of faith, from different tribes and cultures, with compassion, not condemnation. In our modern, globalized society, Muslim women especially are often placed under the microscope, judged by their clothing rather than their character. This is not the Islamic way. A woman's piety, intelligence, contribution to society, and moral strength are all parts of her modesty, not just her attire. Reducing modesty to a piece of cloth strips away the richness of this virtue and leads to division, especially when Muslims begin accusing each other of being un-Islamic based on superficial differences. The diversity in how Muslims express their modesty should be respected, so long as it aligns with the intention of pleasing Allah and maintaining dignity. We must be careful not to allow cultural expectations to overshadow the universal values of our faith. Islam, at its core, teaches honor, respect, and the importance of good character in all aspects of life, especially when engaging with others. The principles of diplomacy and hospitality are deeply rooted in the Sunnah of the Prophet, Muhammad, peace be upon him, who was known for welcoming people from all backgrounds with grace, wisdom, and open-heartedness. When foreign guests were received in Medina, the Prophet treated them with dignity and never humiliated them, even if their customs or appearance were unfamiliar. This shows that hospitality in Islam is not based on how closely others resemble us, but on how we uphold our values while respecting theirs. In this light, when a Muslim country like Qatar receives a world leader with displays that may seem culturally modern or unconventional to some observers, it should not immediately be viewed as a betrayal of Islamic principles. True Islamic hospitality is about kindness, generosity, and offering safety and honor to the guest. It is not about putting on a performance or making everyone conform to a particular appearance. The Quran and Hadith place immense value on honoring the guest, regardless of their faith or nationality. When the people of Qatar or any Muslim nation engage in international diplomacy, they are balancing religious values with the expectations of global engagement. This may include showcasing parts of their society that reflect progress, empowerment, or cultural identity. To assume that any public image which doesn't align with one's personal interpretation of Islam is somehow sinful or un-Islamic is a shallow and narrow understanding of how Islam operates in diverse environments. We must also acknowledge that Islam has always been adaptable and pragmatic in how it interacts with the world. The Prophet himself entered treaties with non-Muslim tribes, invited delegations into the mosque, and exchanged gifts and courtesies with rulers who did not share his faith. These acts of diplomacy were not compromises of Islamic principles, but expressions of them. In a similar way, when modern Muslim states engage in global diplomacy, including ceremonial greetings or cultural performances, they are often doing so within the framework of goodwill and international respect. It is not necessary that every individual representing the country be dressed in a specific religious way for the event to be considered Islamic in spirit. Criticism that stems from a rigid or idealized vision of how Islamic hospitality should appear ignores the complexities of the modern world. Such judgments may reflect a limited understanding of Islamic history and a lack of awareness of the broader goals of Sharia, which are to protect life, honor, religion, intellect, and wealth. By focusing narrowly on appearances, we risk losing the essence of what makes our actions Islamic: intention, sincerity, and justice. The duty of Muslims is to uphold their values while engaging with the world in a way that reflects the beauty and mercy of Islam. Harsh judgments and quick accusations based on isolated images serve no purpose but to divide and distract us from the greater mission of embodying Islamic ethics in every interaction. We must ask ourselves whether we are preserving the heart of Islam or getting lost in its shadows. The strength of the Muslim Ummah has always come from its balance, its ability to remain principled while being flexible, to stay rooted while reaching outward. Hospitality and diplomacy are not moments to abandon Islam. They are moments to reflect its highest ideals, and those ideals are not measured by the length of a garment or the style of a welcome, but by the character of our conduct and the integrity of our intentions. Islam teaches its followers to focus on the heart, the intention behind actions, and the moral fabric of a person's character rather than being preoccupied with outward appearances. Yet in today's world, particularly in the age of social media and viral images, there is a growing tendency to react to what is seen rather than to understand what lies beneath. Judging based on the surface leads to shallow interpretations and false conclusions, especially when people begin to equate the level of someone's faith with the way they look or dress. This is not the method of the Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, who constantly reminded his followers that Allah does not look at their bodies or appearances but at their hearts and deeds. Islam never taught us to reduce people to their clothing, their wealth, or their public image. It taught us to seek depth, sincerity, and truth. This becomes especially important when evaluating situations such as diplomatic events, cultural showcases, or national ceremonies. A single image of women with uncovered hair greeting a foreign dignitary should not become the basis for questioning an entire nation's Islamic identity. Appearances can be misleading, and without context, they tell an incomplete story. Those women may be professionals, citizens representing their country with pride, or individuals adhering to the norms of a certain role or protocol. To pass judgment without understanding their intentions, background, or personal beliefs is to act against the very teachings of Islam, which command fairness, caution, and empathy before criticism. The Quran repeatedly warns against suspicion and encourages believers to verify and seek knowledge before forming opinions. Furthermore, when Muslims focus too much on the visual and neglect the spiritual, they risk falling into hypocrisy. A person may be outwardly modest but inwardly arrogant or harsh in judgment. Another may not appear traditionally religious but may have a heart filled with faith, mercy, and sincerity. It is this sincerity that Islam values above all else. The Prophet himself embraced people from all walks of life, including those whose appearances did not conform to traditional expectations. He corrected with wisdom, guided with love, and showed patience with those who were learning. We must ask ourselves if we are following this prophetic example, or simply reacting based on emotion and assumption. Superficial judgment also creates divisions within the Muslim Ummah. When people are labeled as good or bad Muslims based solely on clothing or appearance, it discourages spiritual growth and open dialogue. It can push people away from the religion rather than draw them closer. Islam is a religion that welcomes, uplifts, and transforms. It does not slam doors based on how someone looks. As believers, we are instructed to give people the benefit of the doubt, to advise kindly, and to reflect on our own shortcomings before highlighting those of others. Focusing on outer appearances often blinds us to the real work of the soul, which is where true faith lies. In an age where perception is everything, Muslims must be careful not to let their perceptions become tools of judgment. Instead of asking, "Does this look Islamic?" the deeper question is this action just, respectful, and rooted in Islamic ethics? That is the standard we should hold ourselves and others to. Appearance may inform, but it should never define our final judgment. Islam is more than a look. It is a light that shines through behavior, speech, and intention. When we remember this, we protect the soul of our faith from being reduced to a set of visuals, and we uphold the honor of Islam by focusing on what truly matters. The unity of the Muslim Ummah is a core value in Islam, emphasized repeatedly in the Quran and the teachings of the Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him. However, this unity is fragile when Muslims begin to divide over external differences such as clothing styles, cultural expressions, or interpretations of modesty. One of the unfortunate trends in recent times is the quickness with which Muslims judge one another based on surface-level observances rather than looking at the deeper bonds that unite them: faith in Allah, love for the Prophet, and a shared commitment to the principles of justice, mercy, and righteousness. These divisions, often sparked by viral images or emotional reactions, damage the strength of the Ummah more than any external threat. When a single picture becomes the reason to label a nation, a people, or a culture as un-Islamic, we are not protecting Islam. We are weakening its community from within. Islam was revealed to people of different cultures, languages, and social contexts, and it has always embraced diversity within its framework. From the deserts of Arabia to the jungles of Southeast Asia, and from the plains of Africa to the cities of Europe, Islam has found a home in many cultures, each expressing the faith in ways consistent with their traditions while remaining true to its core principles. This diversity is not something to be feared or criticized. It is a sign of Allah's wisdom and the global message of Islam. The Quran itself tells us that Allah created us into nations and tribes so that we may know one another, not despise one another. When we begin to see minor cultural differences as religious deviance, we go against the very spirit of that verse. Much of the disunity we see today stems from a failure to distinguish between what is essential in Islam and what is cultural or interpretative. The essentials, belief in one God, prayer, fasting, justice, mercy are non-negotiable, but the way modesty is expressed, the forms of greeting, or the style of public ceremonies can and do vary. When Qatar welcomed a foreign leader with women in a particular dress, it should have prompted thoughtful discussion, not immediate condemnation. The moment we assume that only one version of Islamic expression is valid, we shut the door to dialogue, learning, and mutual respect. That door, once closed, leads only to division, suspicion, and fitna among the believers. True unity requires humility. It requires that we recognize the limits of our own understanding and give space to others who may be living Islam differently but sincerely. Unity is not uniformity. It is cooperation despite difference, love despite disagreement, and solidarity despite diversity. The early Muslim community itself had differences in opinion, in jurisprudence, and in practice, yet they remained united in faith and loyalty to the message of Islam. If we want to preserve this unity in our time, we must resist the urge to divide over things that are not fundamental to our religion. Rather than focusing on who is wearing what, or how someone is appearing in a diplomatic event, our energy should be invested in building bridges, increasing knowledge, and uplifting the moral and spiritual condition of the Ummah. We need to move away from a mindset that looks for faults and toward one that looks for common ground. The world is already hostile enough to Muslims. We do not need to add internal hostility to that burden. The Prophet taught us to be brothers to one another, to stand shoulder to shoulder, and to refrain from suspicion and backbiting. These teachings are not just ethical, they are necessary for survival in a world that seeks to divide us. Holding on to unity means letting go of superficial judgment and embracing each other in the shared light of faith.